let's talk about the Arrows Trilogy by Mercedes Lackey, which or the Heralds of Valdemar series, the first three entries thereof, which are Arrows of the Queen, Arrows Flight, and Arrows Fall. Valdemar, it is her big, massive series spanning dozens of books since 1984 or 5 or something like that. And this is where it started in the late 80s, with recommendations from other realms, rave reviews, romantic times, and I feel there's something else floating around. But yeah, very much encouraged by, amongst others, CJ Cherry and Andre Norton, both of whom I've reviewed here on this channel. Marion Zimmer Bradley is a dedicatee who told her she could do it. Very much in circles of important writers in that period. Also seen, I think widely seen, I mean, I first came across the name in the context of the role-playing game Blue Rose, which is based on Valdemar and this sort of romantic fantasy genre. And in that context, I understood her, and do understand her now, as what often called the Queen of Romantic Fantasy. Partly her productivity, but partly there's a position she holds in that subgenre. And I hadn't read anything by her beforehand. The only super dedicated romantic fantasy I'd read before that would be marketed like that is, I think the only I've read is by Lindsay Buroker. However, there are definitely other very important, more famous authors, more widely known authors, who fit into that subgenre sometimes, are influenced by it, and by that I mean there is a meeting of the romance genre and sci-fi fantasy, whatever it is. And CJ Cherry, in my only experience of her, is not very much like that, though she may be in other books, but certainly Andre Norton, mentioned in dedications and elsewhere by Lackey, is one. So is Anne McCaffrey, and indeed one of my favourite authors. I'm currently reading a book by her, and about the most decorated Hugo nominee winner ever, Lois McMaster Bujold, very strongly is at the intersection of romance and sci-fi fantasy. So those are better known and more decorated. So it's not, I don't know if that is that the literary fantasy escape route. They've kind of escaped the silo of the subgenre. On the other hand, I think maybe that's the positive way to put it, is that Lackey is known as the Queen of Romantic Fantasy because she has made that subgenre her own in the sort of exploring every crevice way, rather than with her sheer productivity, with her sheer ability to explore things in the way that you do see the pulp authors do. And it's useful to see romantic fantasy in that sense as a pulp genre. So what did I think? Apart from that, this is a genuinely interesting historical thing to read. Well, the headline is that despite some very, very, very significant criticisms, I largely enjoyed myself, and I don't rule out reading more, which is not what I always say about mediocre books. There's some stuff here which is quite interesting. There are very serious flaws, which, in a way, in my experience, my view of it, I end up almost having to find part of the fun of it. But there was enough there that I thought, yeah, there was a sense that here I'm reading the first published books in someone's career, and there are issues that some of it probably is polish related, some of it is practice related, some of it may be to do with needing a better editor. But I would not be surprised if several of the things I say in criticism, if I read books from her 5-10 years later, would be much better. At least I wouldn't be surprised, as I say. So I'm going to start with a very quick summary of what's going on in the books, what the story is, then give criticisms, and then finish with what I think my main takeaways, my positive takeaways were. So first, just to say, this is about a world called Valdemar. It's the story of Talia, who's a daughter of the repressive Holderfolk, who's chosen by the immortal companion, who's a horse, Roland, to become one of the legendary Heralds of Valdemar. Companions like Roland are mystical horse-like beings with powers beyond imagining, including the power to sense an awakening potential for special talents of the mind in certain young men and women like Talia. With Roland's help, Talia will learn to master her unique mental abilities of telepathy and empathy, and will grow from an uncertain and inexperienced herald trainee to become the most important herald of all, the Queen's own. And together, Talia and Roland will fight to protect the Queen, the heir to the throne, and the entire kingdom from dangerous conspiracies, looming unrest, vicious treachery, and even an evil and ancient sorcery beyond the magic of the heralds themselves. So it's, you can see the covers, which have a very distinctive feel. Like if you, it makes me feel of, you know, if you like certain, who is literally the most famous guy whose name, every time I see it, I remember the guy, the Wheel of Time guy, like that. If you, you know, there's very distinctive fantasy art styles of the 80s and 90s, which I think we correctly identify with that period and with that style. And you still see some of their descendants now, like American covers for Sanderson novels, lean that way. And these are in that style, but with a very distinctive, like the layout of the covers. I genuinely really enjoy the layout of these covers. They're basically kind of high fantasy with magical horses and magical powers and heroes, the heralds who go around saving people and doing stuff with magical powers. And there's a lot of romance, and in that I mean in the broader sense, i.e. romantic love, sex, relational themes which aren't necessarily positive as well. You know, that's part of the romance genre, is sometimes exploring or engaging with more broken parts of things. And Talia is our young heroine initially, who grows up, she's still very young by the end. She goes from a mid-teen or whatever it might be to a later teen or 20. And she becomes a very powerful, you know, herald. And the thing about Queen's Herald is that Roland is a special kind of companion who has chosen her to be the advisor and cohort of the Queen or King of Valdemar themselves, like a special kind of companion, a special kind of herald. So we'll start with the low points because I might as well get them out of the way, and because in some ways they're what choose on me about it, you know, and I think about it, I'm like, oh, I quite liked that, and then I think, except. So let's clear the ground. There are a number of issues here, and I'll rattle through them. The dialogue, often excruciating. The actual descriptive writing and stuff I'll get to, but is mediocre to good. The dialogue is nearly uniformly just quite bad. Like, it's not, well, it's okay. You know, it's bad. It's often quite bad. And there are particular tics and habits which are so pervasive as to be infuriating. You know, and not even to kind of be funny, infuriating, just frustrating. Like endless pet names, everyone having pet names for everyone, and they're all incredibly cringy pet names that if anyone called you that, you would assume that they were some sort of dangerous maniac. There's tics all over the writing, in fact. But particularly in the dialogue, where often you get very, very static, that sounds cool kind of lines that aren't actually cool, they don't flow. It just doesn't work. That's something which, and that's the kind of thing you can imagine improving over a career. So I only comment on these, but it was maybe the single biggest problem over the whole trilogy. You could reasonably say that Talia is the common term is a Mary Sue. I quite like Talia at points. This problem actually gets worse as the books go on, I think. And I'm thinking mostly, actually, I'm thinking the third one, which there are different problems with. But I think there is a real problem with whether or not she has challenges or needs to do anything, or if there can be growth in her that isn't simply her being not confident and needing to become confident. Flaws, basically, rather than simply a need for more affirmation. And because we get dramatic tension out of those things, there is a criticism there. For me, actually, that wasn't as big a problem as it could have been, but I think as it will be for some people, I liked things about Talia, but I think it's relevant. I think she in some ways handles a large supporting cast well. I certainly eventually, I don't actually really know much about a quarter or to a third of the regularly named characters. Couldn't tell you who they are. Others I'm quite good at. I could really say these are what's relevant, but that really is mostly core characters. I think there is a problem where there's this big cast and there's not enough being put on them. Even Selene, the Queen, You really only get a couple of characters where there's really a lot where you're like, yes, that's the character. Again, that's I think something that can improve. You can imagine that becoming stronger. I think it's a profoundly political trilogy. And here's one thing. I mean, one of my takes would be that basically all fiction is well, everything is preaching at some level. Everything is telling you things to think, how to think, what the real world is really like, and what should happen to make it better. Virtually everything. And that's not different with fiction. What you could say about Lackey is that there is the subtlety of a jackhammer in this stuff. She is very clear about the repressive patriarchal holder folk, and this isn't just kind of oh well, you see how repressive and patriarchal they are. That's a show not tell. It's just a tell, and you keep being told, and you're told about any of these issues on Lackey's mind as a thoughtful, progressive American of the 1980s. All these things where she's thought about things and she's like, I need to communicate this. It's all just kind of like, by the way, here I, Mercedes Lackey, will tell you something. And that is a weakness, not because the views themselves aren't to be communicated. Everything is telling you something, right? You know, you're going to read stuff that has views all over the spectrum if you're willing to engage with the spectrum, at least. But it's about competence and about effectiveness of communication, and I think it's fair to say that she struggles with that in this trilogy again. It's all blindingly obvious what she thinks. It's always hammered over your head ad nauseum, with many points you just have to hear literally 30 or 40 times. A specific criticism is that the plots are never complex in themselves. That's not a criticism. There's often a degree to which you're kind of just going from one place to the next, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. In the third book, in Arrows Fall, this hits crisis point as the overarching plot, technically the main plot of the book, is okay, actually. But the overarching kind of mystery plot and the thing that you're dealing with a lot of the time is just actively very bad and stupid and obvious and boring. And that's quite frustrating because that takes up page spanning, like lots of pages. There's also in the third book a set of relationships that just is so ridiculous and relies tensions relying on the not bothering to talk to each other trope, things like that, to a ridiculous extent that makes you sort of hate everyone involved. But with that said, that's a laundry list of complaints, and it's a serious set of complaints because you're spending your time reading 700 pages of stuff. You want to know what's going wrong. However, I said I liked them, and I didn't like Arrows Fall as much. I was glad it was over. It's also rushed at the end. It's not a very good book. It's not a terrible book. There are still in fact, probably some of the most powerful moments, powerful depictions of things are in Arrows Fall. It's interesting, isn't it, that there's a point where she's beginning to summon real emotional and imaginative power in a book that is just kind of waste. But I generally like Talia, and given that she could be seen as an annoying character, and certainly she has a degree of like a woe is me character going on, it's an accomplishment, I think, that there are things, there's just enough going on that she's kind of likeable in the background. Partly Lackey is good at giving characters scenes, not always, problem in the third book, but she's good at giving scenes, just things where people talk, where you establish relationships and character, where nothing else has to happen. Maybe an event happens at the end to spur something else on, but there's just character scenes where they develop stuff. This builds up to more dramatic big moments. The small scenes with little moments inside them build up to the big moments, the dramatic things, and that payoff usually works quite well. The world with this kingdom, with these magical horses, and some of the kind of things you know about it and the way things work, some of that is quite clever and interesting. The actual core idea of the collegium of different magical trades at Valdemar, along with the healers, and the bards aren't magical, I guess, but is good. It works well. Some of the some of the sense of what might go on in the kingdom and the tensions the kingdom might face, also quite effective. that's not always particularly well executed, but like I'm talking about kind of, I was thinking, I'm interested in this world. I actually am invested, despite the poor communication at points, I'm invested. And it's not all poor communication. Her script writing actually often hits the point of being good. Like, it's just good. It's nice. I like it. Atmospherics are often strong. Not always, but often. And it's a funny thing to realise that pacing is slightly independent. It's not wholly the same thing as structure and plot. They all relate, but structure and plot are both structural and content issues, whereas pacing is a form issue, as in much more in terms of the actual detailed form as opposed to the structure of the form. And I think just her ability to get from one paragraph to the next, from one event to the next, one chapter to the next, and not spend enormous amounts of time on it is admirable, is good. It's strong here. You'd assume it's going to keep being the case. And it fits that pulp genre thing. Finally, in terms of genre, I think I'll close there. I should say, read the world building. The magic is also kind of interesting. There are a couple of instances of it's fairly soft, and there are a couple of instances of just inventing random powers. There's one, it was something where I thought this was so stupid I attempted to forget it. There is a moment where I think it is Talia, it might be Elspeth, the Queen's daughter, who Talia tries to help out, becomes a mentor to. They come up with a power. I think it's Talia. I'm pretty certain it's Talia. This is the thing. It wasn't very memorable, but it was annoying. It was suddenly like Talia decided she could do that. Decided she would have to do this. It wasn't necessarily, this wasn't something she often thought about. And you're like, okay, this has just been Lackey deciding that there had to be a MacGuffin power to resolve the problem. It's bad writing, but mostly the powers are good. Mostly the powers are interesting. The companions, barring the dialogue, are interesting. I like them a lot. But yes, finally, on the note of genre, there is there's also cool llamas. I like the llamas. In fact, lots of the stuff in the second book of these was my favourite. There's a long section which turns into a bottle episode, which is actually often quite effective. It's about the most sustained her character and plotting are, because it closes itself down heavily and just decides to do something with a couple of characters for a long time. But in terms of genre, I think understanding this as early drafts by an obviously quite gifted writer of a pulp fiction is helpful, because it reminds you that she's working a subgenre and attempting to fill the stylistic niches of it and work lots of things out through that in a way that isn't super high intensity, isn't super high demand, but is basically good fun. And you get that in the Western genre, in the pulp action and horror genres. You get that a little in the crime genre too. And I think there is space for that, not because it's great to just, it's wonderful never having to think about stuff in a book. There's plenty to think about here. But like B-Westerns in the 30s, there is something fascinating about seeing tiny budget, tiny filming time of 2 weeks or so for John Wayne's Poverty Row Westerns, for instance, trying to put everything together and work out what things you're going to be really particularly good at, stunt work basically in those cases, and Gabby Hayes, and working through the formula a little differently each time and mixing a couple of the bits up. And that's something that Lackey does well here. She's clever with, and you can tell she understands what she's doing in that, even though she doesn't always succeed at it. And there's something, for me, very admirable about that, very interesting about that, technically interesting as well, much as anything. Would I recommend these books to anyone? I don't know. I think the fact that the final book in the trilogy is sort of interesting and at points effective. I should say it does have some fairly graphic scenes which some people might not enjoy, related to torture and assault. But given the third book sort of just structurally falls apart, stylistically is at its worst, I don't know if I'd recommend it. There are probably better Lackey trilogies. People who are Lackey fans will almost certainly tell you in the comments if they find this video what you should read. But I would say if you are a reasonably prodigious reader, you read a lot, and you're interested in the history of parts of the genre we all enjoy, then it's not a bad place to go to see that. You know, there are really good things to enjoy in it. And yeah, and if you're interested in the genre, but that, what I've said, turns you off that, there are, I'm sure, other Lackey books to read. Anyway, that's me for today. Tell me if you've read it, what you think in the comments. Other thoughts on romantic fantasy? Any recommendations for Lackey from people who have read more than me? Anyway, till next time.